Chapter 3, Part 1, Classical Greek Civilization, the Hellenic Age. The Hellenic period of Greece was characterized by competitiveness, rivalry, an increasingly urban lifestyle, the demystification of religion, and a high regard for balanced life and moderation in achieving it. This period focused on classicism. Through domestic and foreign affairs such as war and peace, the triumph of Macedonia, Hellenic Greece expanded and became prominent and is often considered the father of modern Western civilization. Now, there are several important phases to the Hellenic Age. The first begins with the Delian League, and in order to understand it, you have to know that the polis life time period, the urban life, focused on adult male citizens only. It excluded all women, slaves, and non-native residents. For about 250,000 people, 10,000 men ruled. This was considered ruled by the people, though, which was an earlier form of democracy. Now, the Delian League was founded in 478 CE, and it was an association of Greek city-states under the leadership of Athens, whose purpose was to continue fighting the Persian Empire after the Greek victory in battle at the Platae at the end of the Greco-Persian Wars. The League's modern name derives from its official meeting place, the island of Delos, where congresses were held in the temple and where the treasury stood in a symbolic gesture. Pericles moved it to Athens in 454 BCE. Shortly after its inception, Athens began to exploit the League's navy for its own benefit. This behavior frequently led to conflict between Athens and the less powerful members of the League. And by 431 BCE, Athens' heavy-handed control of the Delian League prompted the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. The League dissolved upon the war's conclusion in 404 BCE. So this slide explains those periods and then introduces the next period, which was the Spartan and Theban hegemony and the triumph over Macedonia. Okay? Now, during this period, art flourished. And as we've talked about, there was an archaic period that progressed from the Egyptian models. And then it moved into naturalism, an attempt to represent objects as they actually appear, hence the more body-like figures that we saw in the last chapter. And then they started aiming towards more obscure things like feelings and actions. This took them into the classical period, which opens in about 490 BCE, and the golden age of the Greek classicism is considered 480 BCE to 404 BCE, when Athens was defeated in the Peloponnesian Wars. This culture lasted until the death of Alexander the Great. And again, it focused on the polis life and the human nature dictated by the 10,000 men. And again, no women were part of this. Now, women in classical Greek time period were excluded completely from public affairs and were in charge of the household duties such as organization, supervision, and labor. But a special class of women called the hetera, which were often foreign, but who worked as courtesans, entertainers, and prostitutes. Some of the hetera were highly educated women, and so some women chose this position because it was the only way they could get an education. Prostitution was legal in Athens, but it was not practiced by an Athenian. This meant that prostitutes tended to either be slaves or those born of Athenian parents who could not be citizens because they lived elsewhere at the time. Among prostitutes, a distinction was made between the common porne, a viable woman, or the hetera, which was a companion, who was usually an accomplished courtesan and often more educated than respectable wives and daughters, who were sequestered at home and left unschooled. In a society when men tended to marry late, in which marriages were usually not for love in which the women of citizen families often were secluded to be least talked about by men, in the words of Hercules. The role of the hetera perhaps is inevitable, but it's also enviable in that literally some women wanted this position. It was the social institution of the symposium, or the drinking party, though, that enacted it. Exclusively the province of the privileged male elite, the symposium was characterized by homosexual or bisexual ethos. Philosophical and political discourse and creative competitions in which elegies were sung to the accompaniment of a flute and lyric songs of the lyre, and as the symposiists began to feel the effects of watered wine, the less intellectual, and not always welcomed, embrace of slave boys and flute girls, and of the course of the hetera. The symposium usually took place in the men's room, the most well-appointed room, and around this dining area, participants reclined on a couch, resting on the left elbow and keeping the other hand free. The symposium followed the evening meal and began with libations and a pagan song to Dionysius, the god of wine. Its activities were dictated by a symposiarch who decided upon the entertainment for the occasion and even how much water would be mixed in with it. The symposium might end with a boisterous procession of revelers, accompanied by music and singing in the honor of the god, to yet another drinking party. All of this is depicted on many of the vases of the archaic period, especially the drinking cups used at the symposium. Now, these symposiums were often, think Mardi Gras. This was debauchery at its best. Not permitted to marry a citizen, at least the hetera could hope to captivate one by her wit and beauty, or of a slave to win the purchase of her freedom, which was the very thing that young men were warned against, squandering their fortune on a seductive woman. It's this tension between the perceived raunchiness of a hetera and the ruinous infatuation which they inspired that provides the conventional themes for a whole lot of Greek literature. The hetera, or hetera, had existed in Athens at least since the time of Solon, and the most attractive and talented were celebrated by name. Among them, the most famous was Aspasia, and she was the mistress of Pericles. Born in the Ionian colony of Malvitus, or Maltus, on the coast of Asia Minor, Aspasia immigrated to Athens about 450 BCE and resided there as a resident alien. An accomplished courtesan, educated and trained in the art of conversation and entertainment, she may have met Pericles at the symposium. Not permitted to marry an Athenian citizen, ironically because of legislation that Pericles himself had enacted shortly before Aspasia arrived, she came to live with him as his concubine after Pericles divorced his wife and bore him a child of the same name. Plutarch says in his life that Pericles kissed Aspasia every day, both when he left the house and when he returned. Indeed, other tales relate that he squandered most of his property on her. It was a relationship that the comic poets of the 5th century used to attack them both. Yet, this story provides the only contemporary and often fragmentary evidence for the life of Aspasia. Invariably, she was attacked for her sexual worth and unseemly influence over Pericles and his political policies. She was called a dog-eared concubine, a whore, and a mother to a bastard. She was accused of impiety and of procuring free-born women for Pericles. She was even blamed for starting the Peloponnesian War because of an agreement with Athens and its allies that allowed prostitutes to be taken from the house of Aspasia in retaliation for one of their number having been drunkenly kidnapped. And that, again, is the rumor of one of the starts of the Peloponnesian War. It was her status, though, as a foreigner that also freed Aspasia from the legal restraints that traditionally confined married women to their house and allowed her to participate in the public eye. Mistress of her own house, one of ill repute, and hostess to friends and supporters who visited, she was witty and educated. Lucian has Socrates visit to listen to her discourse, and Plutarch, whose Life of Pericles is one of our earliest biographies, conveys most of what's known about her, and he says that he held Aspasia in high favor because of her, quote, rare political wisdom, end quote, and that she, quote, had the reputation of being associated with the whole succession of Athenians who came to learn her rhetoric, end quote. Aspasia is said by a 10th century Byzantine encyclopedia, she appeared to be, quote, clever with regard to words. She is listed as a sophist and as an early rhetorician.